So we're really excited here, Jason and I, to be here today, to be invited to talk to a bunch of behavior change agents. It's not usual that we have so many of behavior change agents in the same room. So we're really excited to be here in this conference this year. First question is, I think a question that Elizabeth already asked earlier on is, how do we change behaviors? I think that is one question that we ask all the time as behavior change agents. Another one is, what are the levers that, when pulled, can influence behavior change for the better? We all want the answers for these questions. And part of the work that I'm doing with Jason, is trying to uncover some of these answers. We have to understand what are the behavior change determinants, and we're going to get to there. But before we get to there, I want to take one step back and ask you to think, what is behavior change? So it seems obvious, right? But behavior change is quite complex. So behavior change is I like to think of behavior change as a puzzle with multiple pieces. So it's lots and lots of pieces, but they're not static. Think about all of these pieces. They're changing all the time. So even when we know the pieces, they can be changing. So we need first to know the pieces. So I'll talk a little bit about the concept of behavior change here in my next slide. So I want to tell you a little bit of my story, my journey with behavior change. 4 years ago, I started a PhD with sharing, and I wanted to actually to develop a theory of behavior change. So I have a little passion about understanding people's behavior and how people change. So I thought by the end of my 3rd year of PhD, I would have a theory of behavior change with all solutions. Yeah, how naive, right? Yeah. So, well, I finished my PhD 1 year ago, and we're still on this journey of trying to understand behavior change. It was way more complex than I ever thought it was going to be. But one of the key insights that came from the start of my PhD was the concepts of behavior and behavior change. In our field, we treat both as if they were the same. In fact, my research shows that they're not. Behavior is different, not only conceptually, but I tested it, so empirically different from behavior change. Behavior is considered to be a unit of observation measured at one point in time. Behavior change is considered to be a units of observation measured repeatedly over time. This means that behavior is static in nature, while behavior change is, again, the moving pieces. Behavior change is actually dynamic in nature. As we all know, most of the behavior, we don't use a lot of theory in social marketing, but even when we do use theory and frameworks, they're mostly behavioral theories and not behavior change theories. And that is key here, because as social marketers or behavior change agents, we're trying to do what? Change behaviors. So this concept I found a little bit tricky to explain, because people think they're all the same and they're not really to put into a practical illustration. So I decided to move away from human behavior and show you in a tree, nature. So what is the difference between behavior and behavior change in the way that we treat them? First picture in your left-hand side represents behavior at the first point in time, which means it's the behavior measured pre-intervention, while the second picture represents behavior at the second point in time, representing behavior at time point 2, or post-intervention. So what we usually do in our practice is we look at, has there been a change between one point in time and the second point in time? And then when we do look at what has changed and what are the influences of that change. We actually are looking what are the factors influencing the change in the second point in time. What Jason and I are doing is actually we are going one step beyond that, and we are trying to understand what are the factors influencing the actual change between the first point in time and the second point in time. So a little tree illustration for you. Going back to the human behavior domain, think about a person that ran in October 2 days per week. How many of you, raise your hands if you think it's a good thing? Okay, half of the room. What if I told you that in September, they ran 5 days per week? Changes a little bit our perspective, doesn't it? So what we do in our practice is we isolate, we have one measure, and we make assumptions based on that. We don't know if that person has actually changed their behavior positively, negatively, or if they even changed their behavior or not. So we have to move beyond looking at behavior change at one point in time, and we have to start measuring between one point in time and the second point in time. So our practice needs to move beyond cross-sectional design, which means measuring only at one point in time. That's what we usually do in most programs and campaigns, right? I think a lot of you will kind of relate to that. Some of you might be thinking, no, but I do change. I have a pre-survey, I have a post-survey, so I know whether my target audience has actually changed or not. So you will relate, you will be familiar with a graph, sort of like a graph like this, which you usually have in an assessment of a program, of a behavior change program. You will have a control group and a program to compare effectiveness, but you also have a pre-measure and a post-measure. But what does this graph tell us? This graph tells us, yes, there was a change for the average of the whole group. How many people do we know that actually changed positively or in the desired direction? How many people have actually changed in the undesired behavior direction? Do we actually consider that at all when we're assessing behavior change programs? Do we consider why these people changed, or only the factors influencing or explaining the behavior at a second point in time? So we have to consider all of these things when we are assessing behavior change. It is not enough for us just to do one survey post-campaign and think that we're measuring behavior change. We are not measuring behavior change if we're doing a cross-sectional design. If we do a pre-post design, what we need to do is consider changers and non-changers as well. We have to consider the different directions that these people are changing. Are they changing positively or negatively? We have to also understand what are the determinants of that change, and we have to consider all of that in a dynamic perspective, in a moving perspective. These factors, as well as the behavior, is always changing. So I know that I threw a lot of problems here and a lot of complexities and a little bit of criticism in the way that we are doing our practice, but there is good news. There is a way for us to tackle that. There is an actual method that allows us to do just that.
I think I've got my own, Pat. I need the clicker. Thank you. That's a lot of pressure to put onto me as the second half to solve all of the problems that Pat just threw up there, but I'll try my best. I met Pat and Sharon when Pat was about halfway through that PhD journey, where she had convinced herself she was going to come up with the perfect theory of change. And I thought, that sounds like a great journey I'd like to be on. I don't know if I can promise to give you the theory, but I definitely can give you the method of analysing that change. And that's what we've been working on, is this way of actually understanding some of these problems. Who is changing? how many people are changing, what directions are they changing, and really the most important question for us is why? What are the influences or determinants, as we like to call it, of that change? We heard about it before. It's about this idea of removing all of those barriers to change. What are those barriers? What are the things that we can do to create change? So the way that we are approaching that is a dynamic approach that looks a little bit like this. If you want the technicalities, it's called a hidden Markov model, but I don't want to scare you with it, so if you want to hear about that later, come talk to me. But the idea behind it is relatively simple, but quite profound. The idea is that we are starting by putting people into important groups or segments, as we heard before. The key thing that we're doing here, because we're applying this in a real evaluative sense for behaviour change programs, is we are putting people into relevant behavioural segments. So we want to know that these people are either smokers or non-smokers, or these are heavy drinkers, moderate drinkers, non-drinkers, whatever that might be. Now, the really key thing about this method is that those segments are time dependent. And what that means is that if I'm measuring people at 2 points in time, so before and after an evaluation, then I am segmenting them before the evaluation and finding out that before I did anything to them or I engaged with them, they were a heavy drinker. And then I'm segmenting them again at a second point in time, after an intervention or after some time has passed. What that allows us to do then is track at an individual level the people that are moving or changing between these behavioural segments, so actually changing their behaviour. It also allows us to identify the people who have not changed, so they're still in that segment. And really importantly, it allows us to see the directions of change. Some people improve their behaviour. Some people's behaviour actually gets worse. It allows us to really dive into that. And very importantly, once we see those movements, we see the people who behaviour has improved, we see the people who have stayed the same, and we see the people who have regressed. We're looking for what are the factors that are actually associated with all of those different movements. So that's the kind of questions that we are trying to ask. I'm going to give you an example of where we've applied this idea to a real-world setting. This was the Waste Not, Want Not program that was run here by the social marketing at Griffith Group. So this was a community program where the idea was to encourage people to waste less food. The way that that was done was really about trying to increase their confidence, which we just heard about as that being one of the psychological burdens. So this program was designed to give people the ability to actually use rather than waste food. So we had the data that tracked these people pre and post this intervention. What we discovered is that the best way to segment these people was just to straight split them into people who waste food and people who don't. So this was whether people wasted more or less than 10% of the fresh food that they were buying in any given week. By tracking these people dynamically, we learnt that as a result of the program, from the wasters, so people who were wasting food beforehand, 43.8% of them became non-wasters after the program. So almost half of the people who had this undesired behaviour, through the program were able to change that behaviour, which is quite a profound effect. But interestingly, which we didn't necessarily expect to see, was that 5% of people who weren't wasting food started wasting food after the program, which we sort of looked at and like, that's not good. What did we, well, no, I'm going to say we. I had nothing to do with the program. I came in to analyse the data. I'm the stats guy, so I can't claim any of the positive effects from this. So the SM at G group were thinking, what did they do? I'm putting the blame on Pat here. What did they do that made these people get worse? Now, this is where this type of thinking really comes into play, because what we were able to see was that those people who had moved from not wasting any food to wasting food were statistically more likely to not have access to a private garden. That was the key factor that was predicting or explaining that undesired change in behaviour. If we contrast that with people who were improving their behaviour, we saw things like self-efficacy or confidence, attitudes or beliefs around not wasting food, and also, interestingly, age. So suddenly, moving from what Pat showed before, the traditional idea that said, all right, so throughout the campaign, self-efficacy or confidence had improved, that's great. What we now have is a much deeper sense of who changed, how many people changed, and why. This led us down a really interesting path of going, what is it about garden access? And how do we help people who don't have access to a private garden not waste food? We can't tell them, use a compost bin, because they don't have one. So what's our other solution? So as a summary, if we approach behaviour change at the overall level, we do learn interesting things. This is better than taking a purely static approach. But what we're trying to advocate for today is to think of behaviour change at an individual or group-based level and look for who changes, in what direction, and why. So it's time for us to change. It's time for us to change how we think about behaviour, how we think about behaviour change. It's time for us to change how we design evaluations to ensure that we can actually measure change. Things like that Pat mentioned, like actually measuring people at multiple points in time and tracking them in between or during an intervention, pre, during, post, whatever it might be. And then it's about changing how we actually use that data to better understand at an individual level what are some of these determinants or barriers to change. The good news is we're not saying that everybody needs to go out and learn fancy analytical methods. We're not saying go and teach yourself how to do longitudinal change modelling. What we're saying is there's a relatively simple way to start thinking about behaviour change and actually tracking it. What it depends on is really just these 4 steps. We've got to have repeated measures. We need to have at least 2 time points of data to be able to assess change. As we heard from Pat, that is the definition of change. If we only have 1 point of data, we cannot measure change. It's not possible. We need to have repeated measures. Within that repeated measures, we need what we're calling matched samples. And what we mean by that is it's the same people at each of those different points in time. Because to know whether somebody's behaviour now is good or positive, we need to know where it was before. And that allows us actually to predict where it's going to go into the future. But it needs to be the same people. It's no good comparing 2 different groups at 2 points in time because I don't know where those people came from. I then needed dynamic evaluations. And what we mean by that is we need to be measuring things that can change and are relevant to what we are trying to create for whatever the campaign or the impact is. We also need to be measuring things that we think might be the determinants or the things that might drive change or inhibit change, which we heard a lot about in the previous presentation. And then once we have that data, we need to be assessing the rates of change. This, again, doesn't need to be a formal dynamic statistical model. It could be as simple as looking at an individual basis which people got better, which people stayed, and which people regressed, and seeing can we see any trends around demographics, psychographics, norms, behaviours, environmental factors, whatever it might be, of those things that are determining that change. So that is our message for you all today. This is an ongoing stream of work for us. We think we've found a pretty neat method, but we're also not claiming to have all of the answers. We want to keep pushing this idea forward. We want to keep evolving it. So we'd love to collaborate with whoever in the room wants to join us on that journey. Our contact details are up there. We will be at the media wall. And if you've got data that you want us to analyse, let us know.